Hello and welcome, John, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on again.
This is believe it or not, John, this is the 7th time.
Have there been that many? Time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
They do stack up. We started back in 2012. I think it might have been with The Long Descent. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was actually. So it's been a lot has happened in that time, and of course, a lot of things haven't happened as well. So that's a story in itself, which we'll get to. Now, today we're going to be discussing your brand new book. It is entitled Dark Age America, Climate Change, Cultural Collapse, and a Hard Future Ahead. If the title itself doesn't spell out exactly the sort of territory we're going to be roaming around, tell listeners just a little bit about yourself, your work in general, and then set out first the basic premise of the book.
Okay. What should I say about myself? I am a historian. I am a writer. I've done a lot of research into the rise and fall of civilizations, and one of the things that I had to come to terms with early and often is a huge gap between the way most of us think about history in this culture here and now and the way that history actually works. We have this thing, and of course we've talked about this in a previous show, we have this faith in progress. We have this notion that the future should always be better than the past. History is this one-way trip from the caves to the stars. But that's not what history shows. What history shows is that civilizations have a life cycle. They're born, they grow up, they mature, they age, they fall, they die. It's a basic assumption of our sort of civil faith in progress that doesn't apply to us, that can't apply to us. No, we're on our way to the stars, all the usual tropes. In fact, the point of the book, the basic premise of the book, is that the normal cycle of civilizations does apply to us. I would say that there's plenty of evidence in existence right now that we're already well on our way, tipping over the edge on that process of decline and fall. And so this is where things get interesting, because civilizations, of course, are very different. Every civilization develops its own ways of looking at the world, its own sciences, its own arts, its own cultural creations. There's a lot of diversity in civilizations. But when they end, they start becoming more and more similar. And Dark Age societies around the world, I'll get to the meaning of that term in a bit. Dark Age societies around the world are astonishingly similar. You have the kind of society that takes shape in the aftermath of a civilization. It doesn't matter what the civilization is. You're going to have certain basic features in common. So, my project, which originally I explored in my blog, The Arch Druid Report, and then, of course, in this book, was to say, okay, if we take the standard process of decline and fall and the standard post-civilizational society, standard Dark Age society, and then put that onto the map of North America in the wake of our civilization, and then factor in things like climate change and the other things, the little gifts that we're leaving behind to our descendants, what does the next 500 years look like? It's actually very plausible to sketch that out. You can come up with a very clear idea of exactly what we're facing. Now, of course, as the title and subtitle, as you read, suggests, this is not necessarily cheerful news. Certainly not compared to Star Trek fantasies and the like. But it's nice, if the future is our destination, is the place where we'll be spending the rest of our lives, it's a good idea to know what it looks like. And this book is my attempt to sketch out the next 500 years of North American history in advance.
I had an interesting conversation with a younger guy recently, basically a generation down from me, and it was revolving around I had read a newspaper story about the return of supersonic flight, which after the demise of Concorde was pretty much old news, history in the bin, compost heap. And it mentioned in this article the supersonic airliner that Boeing failed to get off the ground or put into commercial production in the 70s. And this young guy was saying, oh, well, yeah, but that production work gave us the 747, which was a wildly successful airliner. It's true. And he was basically just denouncing me as a naysayer and said that, oh, well, there's always been those people. We have trains, planes and automobiles now. And at one time, it wasn't at all clear that those were going to work, and people were saying they couldn't work. I'm sure we all remember in the early days of cars, that they had one guy walking in front of them with a warning flag, which seems absurd now. And his whole argument really, not just regarding supersonic flight, but technological progress in general, was, it was another version of it's different this time.
Except that's an example of massive cherry picking. Of all this, you basically take the handful of technological projects that did turn out to work and say, well, look at those examples. Let's try this one. Well, they said perpetual motion wouldn't work. Guess what? They were right. What about dirigibles? Where are our fleets of dirigibles that we were supposed to have cruising through the skies? Did that work? How about cities under the ocean? When I was a kid, the idea was that by the year 2000 we were going to have cities under the ocean, blah, blah, blah. That didn't work either. We could go on. The fact of the matter is that you can believe that progress always happens, that any technology we can imagine we can have, only if you look at the successes and ignore the failures. There are many, many failures. And so this is one of the reasons that I treat belief in progress as a religion. Because the people who believe in it will defend it with the kind of simplistic, cherry-picked, logically deficient arguments that you normally get from a street preacher. They don't look at it objectively. They don't say, okay, what hasn't worked? What are the things that what are the promises that technology has made that haven't come to pass? It's always, cars. Okay, yeah, some people said that cars were not going to be a functional technology. Arguably, in the long term, they're not, as the smoke coming out of their tailpipes is destabilizing the global climate. But we can set that aside for a while. Okay, we have cars, we have planes, we have trains. There were some naysayers. We don't have perpetual motion. We're not turning lead into gold at any particular pace. We don't have the dirigibles. We don't have supersonic transport. And the reason for that latter, by the way, and it's a crucial one, is it's not economical. We can maybe we can build anything we can imagine, although that's even questionable. Can we afford the result? In many cases, no. So this whole faith-based assumption that anything we can daydream we're guaranteed to have, it's very comforting. It's very reassuring. We can hold it to ourselves like a teddy bear in the face of an increasingly grim future. But it doesn't actually have much relation to the real world.
Well, if we could perhaps give this discussion a headline or a title, perhaps we could borrow the name of one of your previous books, Not the Future We Ordered, because that's really the situation we're looking at the minute. And evidence is piling up left, right and centre that industrial civilization is in trouble. But in response, in general, we seem to be doubling down on the behaviour that's brought us to this state of affairs in the first place. I talk a great deal about the 3 E's on a lot of the shows I do, those being energy, economy and environment. And we know those are tremendously interconnected, but the degree of that interconnectedness is really being shown in stark relief at the moment as problems in one area spill over into another, etc., etc. So perhaps in discussing these areas, we should start with energy, because that is the basis for industrial civilization, without which it cannot exist. And that's really where the energy situation is, where the rubber meets the road at the moment. That's, in terms of problems, that seems to be where a lot of it is going down.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the two places it's going down. The other one is environment, and we'll get to that in due time. The energy situation, this is just at the moment, due to demand destruction and a lot of economic manipulation on the part of the Soviet Union, part of the Russia and a few other places. The price of oil has dropped down, as it did after the two previous spikes that we had in 2008, 2009, and in 2015. Price of oil is down. So everyone's saying, oh, we have all the oil we could possibly want. It doesn't matter. It's going to spike again. My guess is that it's going to be, let's say 2021 when it peaks. What we have going on at this point, in terms of petroleum, is that when the price is high enough to justify production of things like oil out of tar sands and so on, which is very expensive, it's too expensive for people to afford the product. When the price drops to the level that people can afford it, you can no longer afford to keep producing the tar sands. So we're having this whipsawing motion of prices, which is causing a lot of economic disruption. but the thing is, smooth that curve out over the long term, and what we've got is oil production. Well, let me step back here. Oil, quote unquote, petroleum, quote unquote. We have various liquid fuels being produced. They're being lumped together as petroleum. Some of them are, some of them aren't. The stuff that they're getting out of the fracked natural gas wells in Pennsylvania, north of me here. That's actually better for lighter fluid than it is for running cars. It's very thin. The stuff that you get from tar sands it sounds tar. You cut that with lighter fluid, and you turn it into something that you can break down into gasoline and diesel fuel and so on. Basically, all kinds of junk that wasn't being counted as petroleum, that nobody was bothering with 10, 15, 20 years ago, is being thrown into the hopper at this point to maintain some kind of stability in petroleum production, while the big wells running conventional petroleum, all of the legacy fields we've got out there, their production is steadily depleting. So we're in a situation where we're throwing more and more of our economic activity, more and more of available energy and resources into desperately trying to maintain a supply of petroleum in some sense of that word. And we have to, because 40% of the world's energy and all its transportation come from petroleum. Coal is in a very similar situation. The stuff that is being mined now and used as coal is mostly stuff that 100 years ago was being thrown away because it was so low quality. It's riddled with sulfur. It's full of all kinds of impurities and gasolinuses. It's very difficult. It doesn't burn well. It doesn't produce a lot of heat per ton. But it's what we have left. And so we have these increasingly frantic attempts at mountain removal mining and all this kind of stuff. The increasingly frantic attempts to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Natural gas, a little better situation. Best estimates I've seen are that even with the whole fracking business, if that ever manages to pay for itself, we're going to be at peak natural gas by 2030 or so. So basically, all of our fossil fuels are rapidly depleting. All of them are being used as fast as we can extract them, and of course, the Earth is finite. It only has so much fuel in it. So the sort of broad backdrop situation is that we're throwing more and more of our energy and resources into maintaining fossil fuel production, and attempts to replace that with nuclear power or with renewables have fallen flat. You hear a lot of preening over the German solar energy system. Nobody talks about, or very few people talk about, the fact that that only exists because it's propped up by huge government subsidies. Okay, analysis of Spain's big, also heavily subsidized solar energy system suggests, in Spain has a lot of sunlight. They're well to the south, and yet they're producing, in effect, a trickle of energy. They're only economical because they get the subsidies. Nuclear power, of course, is the biggest subsidy dumpster of all. No nation on Earth has ever been able to maintain a nuclear power industry without huge ongoing government subsidies to pay for the fact that nukes simply don't produce power at a cost that people can afford. So we've got this energy background right now, which is not something people are looking at right now because the price of oil is down. That's one of those little things. One of the problems with the short-sightedness of contemporary cultural and political life is precisely that, okay, the prices will down, we're going to forget all about fossil fuel depletion. They'll be talking about it again, give it 2, maybe 3 years, when the prices start soaring again.
Well, one point about considering talking about or not talking about depletion in the context of the price is it doesn't matter what the price is now or ever will be, that will not change the amount.
No, it's a good point, but there's actually a flip side to that. Because if you can only get $10 a barrel, there's a lot of petroleum that basically doesn't exist economically speaking. Because at $10 a barrel, you can't afford to pump it. And if it's $100 a barrel, you can afford to pump more. So there's a way in which economics feeds back into not the physical amount, but the economically available amount. the problem, the difficulty is when you've got prices swinging back and forth wildly, you've got a lot of economic disruption. You've got industries and individuals who are unable to figure out, how much money am I going to have to pay for, to keep my house warm, or to run a fleet of trucks, or to ship this, or to fly that. And that kind of instability imposes massive costs of its own.
Okay, you're absolutely right. That's a point well made, and that is actually how the real world is operating. I guess I was going with a thought experiment which you could apply to oil. You could apply it to rare earth metals or lots of other important resources. And, I was just following through logically to some future situation where it's like literally we can't find any of this stuff. We really don't know where there is anymore. And someone just say, well, it's all right. I've got $1 billion here. Find some. They're saying, no, I don't think you understand.
Yeah. It's the U.S. government has been doing that with moderate Syrian rebels of late, for the last several years. Obama says, get me some moderate Syrian rebels, and the CIA goes off and tries to look for some. And they come back empty-handed. There are none. Okay. But it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, you're right. But one of the things that has blindsided a lot of people in the peak oil scene, and that has led to some very badly mistaken predictions that have ended up discrediting some peak oil writers, unfortunately, is that people take that approach. Okay, we're just going to use it until it runs out, and then we can't find it anymore. But the economic factors bite first and hardest. I mean, it's like there's for example, I forget how much it is, but there's a whole mess of gold dissolved in the oceans. And you could literally extract gold by the kilogram from seawater. If you could do it in an economic fashion, you can't. It's been tried. It's been tried and tried and tried, and at this point, it's become one of those things that people use as a scam. There's no way that you can extract gold from seawater at a price that makes it worth extracting the gold from seawater. It's going to cost you more than you'll get by selling the gold, even at current inflated prices. I've actually had people insist that there's plenty of nuclear fuel in the world. There's even more uranium in seawater than there is gold. Okay, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Another example of point: the ITER fusion reactor research program that is currently the most expensive scientific experiment in history. They've poured like $17 billion down this particular rat hole. It's not yet completed. There will be more. Everyone's going. The people who are cheerleading it certainly are going, oh wow! If we can make this happen, we can take another big step toward fusion power. We have this abundant fusion power. Look at all the hydrogens out there. Okay, fine. How are you going to, if it's taking you, say, $20 billion to build a reactor, how much is electricity going to cost when it comes out of that reactor? Nobody wants to talk about that. And yet that's the one thing that matters. Fusion power is not an option because nobody could afford to use the electricity. You cannot produce electricity at a price that anyone can afford. Therefore, it's a waste of time and money. We should be putting that money into something that will produce something that's economically possible. So that's that. I know we've strayed across from energy into economy, and one of the traps people, it's really important to keep an eye on the 3 E's, but it's important to remember that they all intersect. They all overlap. Each one affects the other. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't matter how much money you have. If we're out of lithium, it doesn't matter if you think you can get an infinite supply of lithium batteries. In the same way, your economics and your energy thing have to deal with the impact on the environment. So it all loops around, it all forms one whole system, and the feedback loops are the major thing here. The feedback loops are hammering us.
Oh, certainly when I studied economics, and you make reference to Economics 101 in the new book, those of us who sat through, and this was introductory economics for teenagers, this was your beginning down the wormhole of economics, and did we ever discuss the environment and any of that? No, it was all abstract stuff on overhead projector, graphs, good X, good Y, demand, supply. It was all purely abstract stuff. did we ever talk about energy only in terms of a commodity. And there was never any question there wouldn't be enough. It would just be a question, well, what's the price of the energy? What's the price of oil? They were very, very discrete so-called disciplines that were, never the twain shall meet, a bit like biology, chemistry, and physics can be these days when we're talking about science. But talking about where energy overlaps then with economy, thinking about net energy, which is a very key concept that is ill understood. If I remember reading somewhere, a good net energy ratio might have been at one time maybe 200 to 1, that you could put 1 unit of energy into extracting a fossil fuel and you could get 200 units of energy out for that. That's good going. That's really good quality stuff. The best. And that has obviously been dropping and dropping. And I've read things like 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1 now. Where I'm going with this, and I have asked you about this before, but I'm putting the point again because not everyone listening to this will have listened to the previous interviews we did. Could you ever imagine a scenario where 1-for-1 energy, absolutely breaking even, pointless on one level, or even somehow less than 1-for-1 energy, and this might sound completely illogical, and it would be, but the extraction might somehow continue, maybe with a different form of energy being used for the extraction compared to the sort of fuel they might be getting out. That charade might continue in order to actually keep a certain type of fuel showing up for a little longer.
As long as you include the words "for a little longer," no question. You can in some case leverage a lot of low quality energy. Okay, energy quality. How much energy concentration do you have per gallon? Let's say, petroleum is incredibly energy dense. One of the things that one of the comparisons that I like to use here is that the energy in 1 gallon of gasoline, if you want to have that in automobile batteries, it takes 1 ton of automobile batteries to have that much energy. So, if let's say, at some point in the future, you have, say, some coal that's still worth mining. You're digging it out by hand. Okay, you have people going in there with picks and shovels. You have, let's say, a huge population, and you need coal, and it doesn't matter to you that you're literally expending more energy in terms of the population, in terms of muscular energy, to get a certain amount to get that than you get back in terms of coal. You can keep that up for a while. You can keep that up for a little while if the difference isn't too great. If it's 1-for-1, let's say, you're producing X amount of food, you're getting that much, you're getting an exact equivalent in coal, but you need the coal more than you need the food. Yes, I could see that for a while, but here's the thing. You cannot maintain the energy you're getting out. The total net energy of your society is the energy on which everything has to operate. That's your budget. Okay? And if you're no longer breaking even, or if you're just breaking even, how are you going to have the energy to maintain everything else out there? So this is what we're seeing this in the United States already. Where we have rural counties that are allowing their roads to go back to gravel because they can no longer afford to keep them paved. We have huge rural districts that are just literally falling apart. They look like the Soviet Union in its last days. It's really quite stunning, and that's because they've been thrown overboard. The United States no longer has the resources because we're throwing so much of our available wealth into maintaining petroleum flow, both by fracking on the one hand, and of course our constant interventions in the Middle East, which are there purely and have been there since the 1970s for the sake of maintaining petroleum flow, keeping the oil flowing to our ports. So you've got this situation already where what's happening is because the net energy is ratcheting down because we no longer have, the 200-to-1 energy ratio you got from light sweet crude from shallow wells. Ultimately, that's what's behind the increasing shortages of resources for everything else. And so, yeah, we can imagine for a little while oil being produced at, when it's actually not economical to do. We have huge government subsidies going into it or what have you. But that's self-terminating because everything else falls apart. Because if you're throwing all your available energy into bringing out energy, what's keeping the rest of society running.
So while we're in the economic sphere, then let's say a word about that which follows on from the energy glut that we enjoyed for a while, which is growth. Just generally economic growth in everything, but it's normally talked about in terms of GDP, for example, of a country, goods and services being produced, etc., etc. That has been the mantra for a long time. It was possible on many fronts for a long time because of the available energy. Now, that's beginning to, well, it has for some time, but it's beginning to more and more noticeably run into brick walls and buffers and problems. And as you pointed out, if you don't have the figures being juiced and the stats being manipulated, actually you begin to see economies, including that of the US, actually in recession. But still, and as recently as today, yesterday, I hear politicians, I don't even know what their actual conversations were about or the points they were making, but I would just hear incidentally floating from the airwaves, improved growth, increased growth, prospects for growth, and get back to growth. That's all there seems to be. And I do wonder quite often because, again, if we think about this logically, what can grow forever? Well, certainly not the human economy on a finite planet. But the people that talk this stuff, to what extent do they actually sort of intellectually believe this? And to what extent do they sort of say to themselves, well, obviously it's nonsense, but what else are we supposed to do? You know, because I mean, to you and I, it just seems like, well, hang on a minute. Nothing else can grow forever. They're just, the planet's not getting any bigger.
The conversations that I've had with people lead me to think that they actually do believe it. And there's a curious kind of psychological blindness that makes that possible. It's a notion that I'm starting to call the permanent present. Okay? People don't actually think about the future. Literally, you try to get people, okay, let's extrapolate this 10 years, 20 years, and people will give you a blank look. Because they literally, to them, the future is more of now. And for some reason, they're stuck there. Increasingly, I watch that with people. And try to tell them that growth is finite, that we live on a finite planet, growth is going to be followed by contraction, okay. And you might as well sprout two spare heads. Literally, you're talking something that they do not get at all, because they're stuck in the permanent present. The past is this sort of vague thing that we escaped from due to progress, and here we are, and it's like the people. I was on a show a while back with Chris Martinson of Peak Prosperity, and he mentioned when he goes around and gives talks to college audiences about the limits to growth, about where we're heading, at some point in there, a bunch of them are going to pick up their iPhones and wave their iPhones as though that disproves what he's saying, as though the fact that we have these technological trinkets proves that progress is still on track and everything's going to be fine, blah, blah, blah. People don't think about the future anymore. Now, in fact, if you extrapolate current rates of growth in anything, you very quickly equal absurdity. I forget who it was that pointed out quite sensibly, this was back in the 70s, that, current rates of human population growth at a certain point, in the not vastly distant future, the total weight of human beings will outweigh the planet Earth. Obviously, this is not going to happen. But, people don't think about the future. They close their minds to the future, possibly because the future is frankly too scary. So, we've got people who are stuck in this belief in growth, belief in progress, belief in, we can't go back, whatever that means. And I really do think most of them do believe it because they don't think. I mean, human beings don't actually do much thinking. It's hard for us. We don't like it. And we like to emote. We're good at emoting. And so when you combine strong emotions and thought-stopping phrases like growth, return to growth, it feels good, it warms our emotional condition, we go, okay, growth, and we stop thinking. I don't know if we will ever get far beyond that. Certainly, looking back through recorded history, you don't get a lot of evidence that human beings are particularly smart. I don't know that Homo sapiens is a particularly accurate description of our species.
There was a point that you brought up in one of your recent blog posts, which I really liked, and you were talking about deep time in terms of our place in it, and we're all sorts of researchers and scientists and historians and anthropologists and everything have all sorts of interesting information about us, about the last 10,000 years, the last 100,000, the last million, the last billion. And it's all fascinating. The long road to how we came to be here, or certainly the theories about it. And you mentioned these little charts that you sometimes see. And I remember seeing one of these back, I think it probably would have been devised in the 70s, but I saw it in the 80s, and it had an environmental warning sort of slant about it. And I can't remember the information attached to it, but the little chart showed how recently, in terms of deep time, human beings have showed up on the Earth. And it was that usual, you see the long span of billions of years when nothing much was happening apart from a molten mass, and then this little tiny sliver right at the right-hand side, usually of the diagram, showing human beings. You're going, wow, you know, I mean, even we thought the dinosaurs were around for a relatively short time, but look at that. And the point you made recently was that this whole, whatever it is, 2 minutes to midnight, or, you know, however many seconds to midnight that we showed up, it stops at midnight. It stops at now. There's never anything in front of that thinking about, well, if we flip over, if we have a mirror image of the next however many billion years, what might that look like? And that's a key kind of block, I think, in our thinking.
Exactly, and I think it's one of the things that blinds people so powerfully to the future, that they're literally taught not to think about it. It's just the big run up to us, full stop. What I did in my blog post was try to do the complete life cycle of life on Earth, seen from its beginning to its end, with us in there, in context. I'm really starting to think that getting the concept of the deep future across to people, the idea of deep time extending forward as well as back, and what does that imply? What can we know about the deep future? And we can actually know quite a bit. The sciences have given us a huge amount of information. History gives us a huge amount of information. There's a lot of stuff we can put in. My book, Dark Age America, in fact, can be thought of as a sort of first very small step. Okay, what can we know about the next 500 years? Quite a bit, actually. And so I tried to sketch that up. But down the road, I think I'm probably going to put some serious work into trying to sketch out the deep future. You know, what is time going to look like from here on? What might it? What are our possibilities? What do we know isn't going to happen? That's often easier to say. And so this is interesting stuff, because it's so untouched. There have been a few projects in this direction. There was this would be back, I think, in the 1980s. I could be wrong. A biologist named Dougal Dixon, I think, did a book called After Man, A Zoology of the Future, where he tried to imagine, okay, what's going to happen? Imagine human beings become extinct. What about 50 million years from now? What about 100 million years from now? It was fascinating stuff. And there have been a few other attempts in that direction, saying, okay, what's going to be around of our civilization in, say, 10 million years? But there's been very, very little of it. And I find that a fascinating prospect, and I think it's one that would really help people put their own lives and their own choices in a better context, much more useful in the permanent present.
Yes, perhaps it would bestow upon us a bit of humility. I don't know, maybe that's too optimistic from my perspective. That
might be a little much to ask for this species.
Okay, well, we've been talking then about economy. Let's throw in something here where it overlaps Venn diagram style with the environment. And there's something that I did first hear about this in my Economics 101, but it wasn't expanded upon. It certainly wasn't given its full weight, and that's the concept of externalities. Now, I'm going to have you speak about this in a second, but essentially, when I first started to discover the real implications of this, these costs of doing business that companies of all sizes, but particularly large ones, that they rack up but they don't pay, that are then forced off onto governments or the environment in general, or the rest of us spread broadly, would make, if they were factored into the costs of doing business or manufacturing products or providing services, would make many of the big household company names that straddle the globe, Colossus-like, would make them absolutely non-functional. They couldn't make money. They'd be out of business if their bank were to demand that they actually make money. You know, the way that if you and I go overdrawn slightly, the bank are charging us and writing letters and sending heavies around to knock on the door, whereas the corporations can lose money, billions seemingly for years, and yet the bank keep extending lines of credit. But I don't want to wander off on a rant there. If you could just address the issue of externalities and explain to people why it's so important, and increasingly so because of environmental costs.
To my mind, the entire issue of externalities is of central importance. As you were saying, an externality is a cost of business that the business doesn't pay. There are huge numbers of them. I remember seeing, along the lines of the thing you mentioned, a careful analysis that showed that the 20 largest industries in the world would all have to operate at a loss if they had to pay all the costs of their own business. So you have, environmental impacts. You have, various other costs that are pushed off onto other people. Okay. The fact that they're externalized doesn't make them go away. And the more externalities build up, somebody's going to be paying these costs. If the business is not paying the cost, people downstream who are drinking poisoned water from industrial waste are paying the cost in their health care. Or everyone pays the cost when the climate goes crazy. Or, and so on and so forth. There's this long cascade. The cost is going to be paid by somebody. But because the companies can pretend it's not us, it's not our problem, they keep on making a paper profit, while society as a whole is suffering increasing economic burdens. At this point, externalities have become a massive economic force. You'll notice that around the world, national economies are stuck in what amounts to stagnation. The only things that are the only quote industries unquote that are really making money are the ones that are basically manipulating the money system. The banks, the real estate, the insurance companies, and so on. All the financial industries. That's where you can make big bucks now, because that's just game playing. That's just all they're doing is shuffling figures. They don't actually have to deal with the grotty world of goods, of actual goods and non-financial services. Everybody else is stuck in stagnation and increasingly in contraction. I mean, if you take the growth in the financial industry in the United States and subtract that from the growth that we've had, the real economy, the economy of actual goods and non-financial services, has been in contraction for years. It is declining. It is in what's the euphemism now, negative growth. And why? I would argue that a very important part of that is the pressure of externalities. The fact that all of these costs are piling up in various places, and increasingly they're piling up in the environment. The obvious place is global climate change. I just shortly before we started this conversation, I had a chance to check out a new report from one of the scientific programs in Antarctica. Another big ice sheet is cracking, and in this case, it's not cracking from the sea; it's cracking from the center, because seawater has flowed through underwater valleys and is literally lifting this entire ice shelf up from beneath and melting it. We're not that far removed from a point when southern Florida, southern Florida is very close to sea level. It gets all its water from shallow aquifers that are filled by rain. Seawater is flowing into those aquifers. We're not that far from the point when southern Florida is going to have to be evacuated because there is no fresh water to drink. Because all the plants in the farms and everything else is dying from saltwater poisoning. We're not that far ultimately from the point when most of Florida is going to be salt marsh. We're not that far from the point when every really big storm along the northeast seaboard sends seawater cascading into the subway tunnels of New York City. These things are real costs. They've been pushed onto the environment, and now the environment is pushing them back. And the fact that the polluting industries don't have to pay for the cost, again, it makes it look profitable in the short term, for now. But, the industry is also dependent on society. It's dependent on a stable economy. It's dependent on a stable planet. And those are going away.
Okay, well then just to say a word about these environmental costs which are piling up. You've mentioned there sea level rise, which obviously affecting places like Florida in particular. And in the book, again, you go into some detail about North America, because that's, what you're concentrating on. But this effects obviously will be global to greater or lesser extent. You see more of these large storms, which, certain parts of the US are used to up to a point, but then you're seeing whether it's the storms increasing in frequency and severity, or whether it's wildfires, droughts, which quite often lead to wildfires. It piles up and still it's kind of like somehow still suppressed a little bit in terms of that, though there's no pattern emerging here. But as with the energy situation and the economic situation we mentioned, it's getting increasingly hard to ignore. But the reaction, it's the same kind of constellation, to use a word that you like, which I've taken to using because I like it as well. It's the same constellation of responses, isn't it? Really, in terms of like denial and denouncement, and but also at the other end of the scale, hysteria, extreme hysteria about, as you often point out, it's got to be complete disaster for us, or the Jetsons' future. It can't be like any exactly. It can't be any messy
Star Trek or Mad Max. Take your pick.
Yeah, exactly. So but the environmental stuff is undeniable now, and of course you factor into not only the Earth systems here, but also in terms of pollution. Never mind nuclear, just in terms of other forms of pollution. Heavy metals and all sorts, dioxins, and I mean, it's again, it's stuff that's piling up as externalities, and it's getting to the point where it can't really be ignored anymore.
And yet, it's precisely because it's not happening suddenly. It's the old thing about how do you boil a frog? You raise the temperature very slowly. By the time the frog realizes that the water is actually hot, it's half cooked and can't jump anymore. This is another of the problems with the what I've called the permanent present. People are not thinking, okay, how long has this been going on? What was going on back 10 years from now, or 10 years ago? Where is this going to end up 10 years from now? Because, and I honestly think, especially here in this country, that people are doing it deliberately. People are fleeing from the future. I've commented on my blog. It used to be that the only bars that had a TV were sports bars, and they had a big TV up front, and when there were sports games, when the football game or something, they'd turn that on, and everyone watched the football game, and then they'd turn it off and cheer, and get drunk. Nowadays, not merely bars, but restaurants, you go in and there are TVs all over the place. You can go into this place where there's screens side by side on every wall. Why? Why on earth would you want that, in a place where you're going for a meal or a drink? And the answer is very simple. People are desperately trying to drown out their awareness of just how bad things are. I've been pointing out, with reference to the recent political convulsions here in the United States, that in the United States, when I was a child back in the 1960s, a family with one ordinary working class income could afford a house, could afford a car, could afford 3 good meals a day for everybody in the family, and have a little left over besides the necessities for a luxury here or there, a few extra toys beneath the Christmas tree, maybe even a vacation. Okay? Nowadays, in the United States, if you have one working class income for a family, you're living on the street. That's an immense change. It's unfolded over half a century. But it's huge, and nobody's talking about it. Everybody's pretending as though it didn't happen and it doesn't matter, and forget about it. I mean, we're talking about half the American people who've been plunged into poverty and misery over half a century. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody wants to look at it or think about it. Now the bottom end of the middle class is being fed through the same thing. We have, all the people who are strutting around, making big money in the computer industry, are all of a sudden finding their jobs offshore.
Yeah, I would say, from my observations in general, but also amongst people I come into contact with, even people middle age of my generation, but notably people younger than that, there's a lot less planning for the future going on. That's how it seems to me. There's the usual vague aspirational stuff about, if you press someone, it's like, oh yeah, we want to own our own house someday, and, we'd like to move to this part of the country, and, we'll have kids someday, and, yada, 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 but it's not the way that I remember my friends when they were starting out in their 20s and maybe met a girl, got married, started a family. There was much more, I want to do this at this point in time, and then I'll take that qualification, and then we'll do this and we'll do that, and by that time I want to have that sort of pension in place. And it was quite goal orientated to the point where sometimes they'd write them down, and I see a lot less of that now. It's kind of just because people, I don't think people feel that they can do it. It's part of not thinking about the future. As far as people along the lines you describe, drowning out the noise in the depths of their minds in sports bars or whatever. Only just today, I saw a friend posted on social media a new compilation of Black Friday clips from American stores. You'll know exactly what to expect here. I've seen my fair share of them. In this particular case, I found myself, hardly surprising really, but I've watched them in the past. I couldn't watch this. It was about 7 or 8 minutes compilation of clips. I watched a bit of the first one, and then I clicked forward a couple of minutes, and then forward another couple of minutes. I just stopped it. I said, I cannot watch this. It was just like wild animals. I mean, that even does wild animals a disservice, because they're normally a bit more orderly about these things. But it's not just... Now, my friend, she said, her comment was, this is what you get. This is a product of massive economic inequality, and also the sort of knee-jerk, reactive thing that you get from modern advertising, where people just want the latest thing and they've got to have it and they can't wait, and if they can't afford it, they want it anyway. But for me, looking at it, it was like, there's a deeper level of psychosis or mental illness involved here. This is not normal. If you were from another planet, or you were somewhat familiar with the human species, but you didn't know that this activity was taking place inside electrical stores or sportswear stores or whatever, then you would think this was a fight for absolute survival, to the death, that these people were fighting to stay alive, not that they were fighting to get a widescreen TV or a games console.
Yeah, one of the things that I see in this country is the way that people have allowed their sense of identity to depend on the products they have to an insane degree. And so, in a sense, it is a fight for survival. It's a fight to be someone. I'm a person with a widescreen TV. That gives me something to be. Otherwise, I'm nothing. And it is insane. It is psychotic, as you said. And we have a whopping bad case of it here in the United States. Black Friday. This year's Black Friday sales were off sharply from last year's, and last year's were bad. Fewer and fewer people have the disposable income. I haven't seen really detailed breakdowns on the decline in sales, the decline in number of shoppers, money spent, this kind of stuff. All of those are down. But I do know that people have reported, I know who've been talking about this, they've been to this mall or that mall or the other mall, and they said it looked like a ghost town. Or it looked like an ordinary Thursday or something. It was not. Where are the crowds? So there are still, places where people are going wild, but in some cases it's because really drastic sales, in some cases money-losing sales, are being offered just to move product. So while the screaming and the psychosis is going on, at least it's becoming less profitable.
I was just going to say a word about population here, because this ties in with the 3 E's as we have mentioned, and it's particularly relevant to the sort of time scale that you're looking at in the new book, the next few hundred years, 500 years, in North America, and this will apply to a lot of other regions of the world and industrial nations. And population, of course, much talked about in terms of it being a problem, it not being a problem. There's been all sorts of discussions and arguments and bun fights about this since the probably limits to growth, but certainly going back to Malthus, for example. This is not a new concern, not a new concept. There might be an issue here. You address this in the book, how population might actually come to be reduced, because as you said earlier on, there's this thought experiment whereby if population keeps growing and no one seems to be talking seriously about it reducing or how that might happen, eventually there'll be so many people that will all be stood right next to each other on the earth and in the ocean, and that'll be it. There'll be no more room for anything. That's absurd. It's not going to happen. So
it's not going to happen.
What is actually going to happen?
Where are we going to be growing food? Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And we're talking about, in the potential long-term future, medium to long-term future, we could be talking about billions of people sort of, whether natural causes or otherwise, not being here anymore?
The first thing that I have to remind everybody when it comes, well, there are two things I have to remind everybody when it comes to population. It's not that, billions of people will die. Those billions of people are going to die one way or the other. All of us die. Okay? No human being lives forever. And so we've got a death rate. Okay? There are 7 billion people on the planet. All 7 billion of those are going to die at some point. It matters that there is the variable here is how effectively do they reproduce. Now, the second thing is that population is a dependent variable. It is not some outside force that controls itself. It is a function of various complex variables, largely relating to available resources. Okay, if you do not have food, you will starve to death rather than reproducing. Now, one of the reason that I point these things out is that there's a presupposition that the only way population can decline, the only ways are, on the one hand, apocalyptic catastrophe. On the other hand, some kind of voluntary decision to reduce our population. Now, people have been trying to do the voluntary population reduction thing forever. As I recall, they were certainly in full swing when I was a kid, and we had 3 billion people on the planet. There are now 7 billion people on the planet. They're still trying the same thing. Obviously, it doesn't work. But we're running out of resources. We're running out of energy resources. We're running out of topsoil. We're running out of stable climate necessary to grow foodstuffs. And one of the ways we can see this beginning to shape up is the fact that the rate of population increase in large sections of the third world, places that had very high rates of population increase 10 years ago, has dropped sharply. They're running up against the hard limits to growth. And so I think you will find as we proceed that death rates will rise above birth rates in those and other areas. That's already the case in the United States and Europe. The death rate, both in the United States and in Europe, the death rate is so far above the birth rate that populations will be declining steadily, except for immigration. And as that process continues, as the limits to growth clamp down, we will see population decline, not via catastrophe. I mean, there will doubtless be wars and plagues and famines and things like that, but mostly it's simple demographics. People who no longer have the resources to survive to reproductive maturity or to reproduce. And death rates rise above birth rates, and the population declines, and declines, and declines. It's not just as it took us quite a while to get here, up to 7 billion. It's going to take us a while to get back down, but we will. One of the reliable things in terms of the decline and fall of civilizations, when you have full-scale civilizational collapse, you have the full process of decline and fall unfolding over the usual few centuries. At the bottom, your population level is typically around 5% of what it was at the top. So we have 500 million people in North America right now, something like that, okay? At the end of the thing, we might have 25 million. 25 million people in the entire continent. This does vary. It depends a lot on whether a society in decline is able to maintain some kind of political stability, some kind of organizational stability. When Rome fell, for example, the Western Roman Empire populations collapsed dramatically. I remember an account of a war between two kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, or very early on, and so these are two kings, and they have their armies, and the two armies had fewer than 100 men each. That was the army of a kingdom in those days. There were very few people. You read early Anglo-Saxon poetry, and you get a very clear sense of a landscape that's dotted with little villages with vast empty tracts between them. And old Roman cities here and there, where everyone thinks, well, those must have been built by giants. People could never have done something like that. And they're, of course, completely empty, except for people going into to pry loose stone. That's a post-Dark Age environment. But that was the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire population decline was about 50% because the Eastern Roman Empire morphed into the Byzantine Empire, retained a fair amount of stability and economic integrity through the whole process. And so their population only declined by half. We could see similar transformations this time around. North America, the nations are too big. The level of environmental trauma that we're facing is too big. I expect us to be around the 25% range, or what am I saying, the 5% range in terms of how much population we'll actually have compared to what we have now. Europe, if it plays its cards right, might be better off. Might not. It's going to be a messy time.
One other phenomenon that I just want to briefly touch upon, which is really very much in the headlines now, and that is mass movements of people, mass migration, immigration as well. That's a real hot potato here in Europe at the minute. We did a conversation about Brexit, about Britain leaving or the UK more correctly, leaving the European Union, and immigration being a huge issue at back of all that. I also did a show with a guy called Giles Slade, and that was called American Exodus, and that was about future mass movements of populations across North America. You address this in your new book. To what extent do you think that, because we can also talk about politics here, because that's been politicized and used as a football or a club to beat other people, however you want to express it. And it's been seen again, as always, the problem is the other. It's certain, people who have the wrong color or people with the wrong accent or whatever it happens to be, coming from somewhere else to muscle in our resources. But take all of that, all those prejudices and things out of the equation, and those differences between people, the superficial differences. This is just something we're going to have to get used to. And for me, this is the big elephant in the room when it comes to what's happening in the Middle East at the minute. All these people, to use a political term that was used by mostly the right wing here in Europe and the UK, people swarming from the Middle East into, they're doing that. I attended a lecture recently by an Iranian university lecturer working here in the UK, and the upshot of that was, I was so pleased to hear him say it, that what's going on in the Middle East is down to food and water, and he called a big chunk of the Middle East, take out fossil fuels and air conditioning in Qatar and Dubai and all that stuff. He called it ecologically dead or dying. That's what he called the Middle East. So we're going to see these mass movements of people increase.
Now, to some extent, the recent waves of mass movement have been caused by the absolutely ham-handed, idiotic U.S. and U.S. ally policy toward Syria, toward Libya. Hey, let's, Hillary Clinton's thing. Hey, let's overthrow some governments and plunge two big countries into permanent civil war. What a great idea! And so that stirred up a lot of what you're getting in Europe is people from Syria, people from Libya, but not just from there. And in the long run, the Middle East has had a huge upsurge in population, one of the most dramatic on record. There are millions upon millions of people whose survival is possible only because there's all that oil flowing out, and the oil's running short. And a lot of very expansive assumptions that were made 10, 15, 20 years ago by the Saudi government and the various other governments in the Gulf states, all of a sudden they can't afford it anymore, because of course the price of oil is doing a downswing, but maintaining oil production is increasingly not easy. They have to put more and more of their energy, again back to the net energy thing. They have to put more and more energy and other resources into maintaining their fuel production. So it's a powder keg, and exactly how it's going to blow and in what direction is a very, very ugly question. It does no one any good for, on the one hand, people on the right, people on the right, people on the left, people making it out to be about race. It's not about race. It's about how many people can you feed. A lot of Europeans have, at this point, have forgotten, which is quite remarkable, as it was not that long ago. They've forgotten the days of the 1930s and 1940s when, feeding the population was really a crisis. I'm afraid they're going to get a reminder of that. Europe is very crowded. It survived. I know in Britain, a vast percentage of the food you eat comes from overseas. It's a little island with a lot of people on it. And so at a certain point, you have to start asking yourself, how many people can we feed? And nobody wants to ask that question because, of course, progress, growth, everything, the permanent present. There's groceries on the store shelves now. we're not going to think about the future.
Okay, for the last section of our talk, John, we're going to look a little bit at the prospects for the future. Where we are right now, the near future, and maybe some just thoughts and general ideas going forward as things that we can do and things that we can't do. Where we are right now, we've been talking about politics. Let's just mention the US situation. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, Trump. Hardly surprising, really, in the context of your book. Not at all surprising to see this guy bulldozing his way through the establishment.
Yeah.
In terms of your concepts in the book of abstract power versus concrete power and how that'll play out in the future, is Trump even 5% tribal warlord as opposed to ineffectual bureaucrat? Is he the first future echo of a strong man in charge?
Yeah. Yes. And in fact, that's an important point to understanding his appeal. He presented himself very effectively as an outsider, as somebody who was not part of the bureaucracy, not part of the Washington, D.C. blob, coming from outside of the Beltway with his own ideas and with an ear actually turned to what a very large portion of the American people were saying. And, of course, all of the people whose interests lie with the existing order had been screeching at the top of their lungs, oh my God, he's a racist, he's a sexist, he's a homophobe, he's an Islamophobe, blah, blah, blah. That's because they don't want to talk about the issues that he's raised and the fact that a very large number of Americans think that they are the problem, not him. So, yeah, Trump, the thing is, Trump is, as you say, a very faint first echo. If he plays his cards well, if he has a successful presidency, manages to achieve a certain amount of, at least some movement toward getting the U.S. out of the trade treaties that have ground our working class into the dirt, enforcing our immigration laws, doing a few other things like that, he could actually stabilize things for a while. One of the problems we always have in a society on its way down, and I discuss this in the book, of course, is the way that society splits into a political class and everyone, and the people who are excluded from politics. We've got a whopping case of that here in the United States. We've got our media, we've got our pundits, we've got our political class, we've got our talking heads in various places. The affluent, the people along the two coasts, in the bicoastal, affluent, privileged bubble, for whom everything is fine and all that matters is getting a woman into the White House. Even, despite her records with regard to war and so on and so forth. We can get into that. And then you have everyone else whose views and needs and interests and concerns have been completely excluded from the political process. And the everyone else, we're told by the media. I mean, every newspaper in North America, or in the United States, as far as I know, backed Clinton. And yet, the people just sort of shrugged and said, no, thank you. One turkey this November is enough. And they voted for Trump. And the screaming that you hear, the shrieks of outrage, the histrionic grief and terror and all this kind of stuff, all the 2-year-old tantrum that's been in the media, the various privileged classes are doing, that's born of the realization that they don't have the power they think they do, that they can't simply snap their fingers and make their soi-disant lessers, leap to behave the way they're told. If Trump had lost 4 years from now, we might well have had something worse. I don't think a lot of people in Europe really realize just how tense, how bad the situation is here in the United States, how much it resembles a society in free fall. You get away from the nice rich coastal bubbles, and you're in a country that is in profound contraction, a country again where the roads are being left to go to gravel, where the housing stock, the buildings look again like the Soviet Union in its last days, and for very similar reasons. You have a country in deep trouble and profound turmoil. I've had people outside of the United States when I've spoken at events. I've pointed out, unless something changes, the United States is within a decade or so of a domestic insurgency. We are looking at the prospect of civil war because millions upon millions of Americans feel completely shut out of the political process, and a great many of those millions and millions of Americans are rather well armed. This is not a recipe for a peaceful future. One of the possible benefits of Trump's victory is that those well-armed people are no longer feeling quite so shut out. And if he can give them some of the things they need, like, taking out the trade treaties that have cost the United States so many jobs, such as pulling us out of this monomaniacal posture of confrontation toward the Russians, the Chinese, anybody else in the world. Bring the troops home, for heaven's sakes. We've spent way too much money on defending the rest of the world. If he can do that, then I think it's still possible that we could avoid a domestic insurgency or a civil war here in the United States. If he doesn't, if he crumples, if the DC blob continues on its existing policies, it's going to be a really ugly future.
Now, just as we were saying earlier towards the top of the hour, that money doesn't equal resources, and that the abstraction of money isn't the answer to the problems. We have this great belief, pseudo-religious belief, in the possibilities and benefits of science and technology. That's certainly where a lot of developments have come, a lot of really life-improving developments and other life-limiting developments, with sort of distractions and trinkets and what have you. But there's been many wonderful inventions in the industrial age, particularly into the computerized age, all sorts of marvels that we could only have dreamt of in previous generations. But we're not only into kind of decreasing returns there, and we could do an entire show on this, but we kind of briefly just have to mention science and technology, the limits thereof. On one hand, we have this response to the challenges that we're facing that are of the techno-utopian variety, whether it's the transhumanists and virtually everybody engaging in a TED talk, all this talk about artificial intelligence and what that's going to do for us. None of this, again, how the resources for any of this are going to happen or what it might mean for, employment or other important human affairs. I think it's very significant that we have the space program. I said it was all but cancelled, the manned space program, and someone argued with me today and said, well, no, it hasn't been cancelled, because the international, the Space Lab or International Space Station, whatever the hell it's called, is still up there in low Earth orbit, doing its experiments. That for me, that's not really the future that I was told about or promised in terms of a manned space program. And then you take into things like the technocratic responses to these things, resource-based economy, zeitgeist movement, zeitgeist non-movement, really. I don't know what they've been doing in the last few years.
First of all, there's a thing called the law of diminishing returns, and it applies to pretty much every human activity. We can see it at work in science. If you look back through the history of any science, you'll find the early discoveries were usually made with really, really simple equipment. I mean, Isaac Newton was working with his own eyes and apparently an apple tree in the process of figuring out the law of gravity. Charles Darwin used very simple gear. The early experiments that gave us the electronic revolution were, again, made with incredibly simple equipment. Fast forward now, the hunt for the Higgs boson. They're pouring billions of dollars into these incredibly expensive things because they've picked all the low-hanging fruit. Here's where you see the limits to science. Again, they're economic limits. There are probably, in fact, I've seen, I don't know, what would you call them? Sort of prospectuses, mind games, if anything. There are things that you could do you could learn about physics by getting a cylinder roughly the mass of the Earth in space and spinning it to within like 99% of the speed of light. There's some really remarkable things you could find out about the structure of space-time. How are you going to afford it? This is one of the major limits of science. Okay, it suffers from the law of diminishing returns. Now, the Ray Kurzweils of the world insist that's not the case. It can't be the case. No, science and technology have a law of increasing returns. He provides no evidence. In point of fact, there's been studies done that have gone through things like patent applications and so on. The peak of invention in the Western world happened in the 1880s. That's because they were getting low-hanging fruit. They were getting things that were relatively easy to invent and discover. At this point, it takes much more investment to make a new discovery or to put it to use. Okay, technology is the same way, and it also has, as we've talked previously, the fact that you have to be able to afford to run the technology once you make it. Again, sure, you can have a flying car. Is it going to be economical? No. A few rich people might have. I mean, there have actually been flying cars since, I think, the 1920s. A few rich people get them. They discovered that since, a car has one set of engineering requirements, a plane has another. Your flying car is a lousy car and a lousy plane that are just happen to be in the same vehicle. You could, for the same price, you get a really good car, a really good plane, and probably pay for the chauffeur and the pilot. So there are limits to technology. There are limits to science. Those limits are being made much, much worse by the way that science and technology have been exploited commercially, and that the externalities, that concept again, of science and technology have been pushed off into the rest of society. One of the best examples these days in the United States is healthcare. We have the most expensive healthcare in the world, and it's some of the worst. Our infant mortality rates are third world. A lot of people die here because of medical malpractice. And a lot of people know this. A huge number of people have been looking at that, and it came out a few years back that there are more visits to alternative healthcare practitioners every year in the United States than there are visits to MDs. That's partly because nobody can afford the MDs. But it's also because people are saying, okay, if I go to the MD, odds are I'm going to get 3 prescriptions which are going to have 16 horrible side effects and probably won't solve the problem. Or I can go to an acupuncturist or an herbalist or a homeopath, and they'll actually listen to me, and they'll come up with a diagnosis. And even if their treatment doesn't work, it's not going to have the 16 horrible side effects. Of course, the medical industry has responded by trying to crack down on alternative health care. But the thing is, this is building up exactly that kind of anti-scientific thought that I discussed. And again, you're right, it's been discussed in science fiction for decades now. Science and technology pursued without any attention to the human cost is going to get a backlash. It's getting the backlash. The backlash is building right now. And the utopian types, the zeitgeist, there was that embarrassing video, Thrive, that did the rounds a while ago. Everything would be wonderful except evil corporation. Not that there's any evidence. Not that they need evidence. It's all feel-good stuff. Or, Ray Kurzweil with his singularity, which is, we've talked about this before. It is the fundamentalist Christian myth of the rapture. It's science fiction drag. You've got computers in place of Jesus, robot bodies in place of the glorified bodies of the elect, outer space is heaven, ... point for point. And Kurzweil has even given a year. It's going to happen by 2049. That's his 2012. That's his nothing happened day. And we'll see if he did the smart thing, and if he will do the smart thing and dies shortly before it happens, so he doesn't have to face the embarrassment. None of that is going to make any difference to our descendants. Our descendants are going to be living in a world that has been ravaged by science and technology. Okay, you commented earlier. Science and technology have produced a lot of really cool, interesting things. Also, a lot of time-wasting things, but they've also produced a vast and ongoing amount of destruction. Okay, the global climate change that is plunging the western half of the United States into Sahara desert conditions, that is flooding, that's going to be flooding the eastern seaboard, that's going to be causing unparalleled human suffering and death over the centuries to come. That did not happen by accident. It happens because our smokestacks, our tailpipes, our science and technology. The nuclear power plants that were scattering across the landscape, making no provision for the cleanup, for some safe storage of the fuel rods once they're used, if there is any place safe. They're going to have to deal with dead zones where everyone knows you don't go there, because if you go there, you die. They're chemical equivalents. We're handing our science, our technology, is handing our descendants a ravaged planet. And if we're going to convince any of them that science and technology are anything other than evil, the evil that destroyed the world, the evil that left them with epidemic cancers from toxic wastes and radioactive wastes, that left them with an unstable climate and rains that sometimes just don't show up, and all the other things, we're going to have to get a move on. We're going to have to start seeing more science being used to help people rather than to assist in the production of externalities so corporations can make a quarterly profit. I don't see a lot of that happening. And unless in particular, the scientific community wakes up, shakes itself out of its stupor, breaks out, steps outside the permanent present and looks at the future and says, "Oh crap!" I think all those science fiction visions of future societies where scientific inquiry gets you burned at the stake might well happen. It will be because they're making a rational response to the world that science and technology left them. I really do hope that can be reversed. I really hope we can see more, especially in the natural sciences, people turning their backs on the idea that science is our means to conquer nature, as though nature is our enemy, and start teaching people how to, for example, do remediation of toxic wastes. That could be done with mushrooms, by the way. There's a guy named Paul Stamets who's done some amazing things with fungal remediation of poisoned soil. There's all kinds of scientific things that can be saved, should be saved, but it's going to take some work, and I don't see a lot of people getting to it now.
Well, just in conclusion, really, I mean, the wheels are in motion here, as we've been talking about for the past 90 minutes or so. People can see these things happening on all these different fronts, and if anyone wants to be more thoughtful or considerate about this, or reflective, just start looking for it. The more you look, the more you'll find, really. Mm-hmm. I think it's significant. I mean, you've talked about infrastructure and malign neglect over there in North America. A couple of the big infrastructure projects here in the UK that have been bandied about for a long time. I would not put money on them being completed. I'm thinking of the third runway for Heathrow, which we're told is essential for growth. I mean, that thing has been back and forward like a ping pong ball for as long as I can remember. And then there's the so-called HS2, High Speed 2, which is a proposed extension of, as it says, high-speed rail tracks from the economic heartland of the UK, which is the southeast, through to the north to create the rather catchy-sounding northern powerhouse. That's going to cut a swathe through farmland and urban areas all the way through the heart of the country. Again, would I invest in that? Would I even put a small bet on it being completed? No, and I think that's significant. There's a lot of talk about it, and a lot of putting it into the long grass yet again. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of this, really, is the sense of possibility kind of going away and things quietly being shelved. I think that you see a lot of that now.
And that's an important thing to watch. Because, basically the mismatch between the fantasies of continued growth and the realities of actual contraction, that's going to widen in the years to come. And as it widens, a lot of people's dreams and hopes and fantasies are going to fall into the gap. I think one of the major things that our listeners can do is keep an eye, mind the gap, as they say in the underground. Keep an eye on the gap between what's being yammered about in the media and what's actually happening on the ground. That's opening into a chasm. And if you just pay attention to the media, you're going to be blindsided by the future.
Final thought on my part. I spend a fair amount of my time working in a museum here, and we have archaeology from Roman through Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman, into the medieval period. And a lot of visitors, particularly those from North America, though I'm really not ragging on your fellow countrymen, but that's just maybe their perspective on history. They say, so when the Romans were after the Vikings, right? And I'm going, no. And they're going, okay, what is this Anglo-Saxon thing? When is this? And the reason they're confused is because they cannot conceive of the obvious splendor of what the Romans created through to the Anglo-Saxon period and the fact that the Vikings just didn't build like that. They just did not build on that scale. And they can't conceive of this advanced. I point out the working drain we still have here, the Roman drain that still works. And the underfloor heating and the weapons technology. And they're saying, no, this must be after the Vikings. I'm like, well, it's not. And I think it's significant that when you get through the Viking period and into the Norman invasion, they started to build on a large scale again. What was the style? Romanesque. Why was it called Romanesque? It's because it was, it looked like some of the Roman stuff, and that was a period of 1,000 years.
You have to remember that the educational system in this country has been, quote, reformed, unquote, several times in ways that have made sure that it basically doesn't teach anybody anything. And at this point, somebody graduating, from 12th grade after 12 years of public schooling in America you basically assume they know nothing worth knowing about history, They know nothing worth knowing about literature. All that they've done is take multiple choice tests and study frantically to get the right answers on the tests so that these schools don't get docked money or this. So there's various kind of stupidities involved. One of the other things that's been thrown under the bus here in the United States is the entire concept of education. So you don't blame them. Don't blame them for too much for being completely clueless about history. That's what they weren't taught anything. And so don't be too hard on the people who can't get it through their heads that the Romans must have come after the Vikings because the Romans are so much more, quote, progressive, unquote. It's probably the first, when they visit that museum, it's probably the first time they've ever encountered the Romans.
Okay, well, I will just say for listeners, I mean, obviously a lot of bleak prognosis here in our discussion. Some of your other books in particular, I'm thinking of, say, for example, Green Wizardry. There's some great ideas about how things might pan out in the ecotechnic future. A lot of your work is full of ideas about constructive things that we can do as individuals, as communities, even as nations, how we might respond to this in the future if we're going to have one. Today, we've been talking about your latest book, as mentioned earlier, Dark Age America, Climate Change, Cultural Collapse and the Hard Future Ahead. That does strike probably the most unequivocal tone, I think, of anything I've seen you publish in terms of like, this is going to happen, something else isn't, we must do this, we must not do that. And I think that just reflects where all the issues that you're concerned with are at the minute. They continue to move on at pace. Tell listeners anything you'd like to about that. It's widely available. Please tell them about your blog, which is published once a week, and anything else you'd like to share.
Okay. Dark Age America is out. It's available at all the usual outlets. You can get it from online retailers. You can also go to www.newsociety.com, order it directly from the publisher. They would be happy to ship it to you. And then, let's see. So there's that. There's my blog, thearchdruidreport.blogspot.com. That's a Wednesday evening experience for me these days. I have a new post on the end of the American century taking shape right now, and that'll be up on Wednesday. I also have a book project that will be out quite shortly that may be of interest. You were talking about responses to constructive responses. This one will get. I suspect there will be some very loud shrieks from the Ray Kurzweils of the world. The title is Retrotopia. It is a novel. It is rather, in a certain sense, like Ecotopia, which was so famous a few decades ago. The idea of deliberate technological regression as an effective response to an unstable future, going back from the fancy, overloaded, over-upgraded mess of the technology we have now, and scaling it back a few